What is a story? If an event is recalled by multiple persons, are they all telling the same story or different ones? Anishinaabe performance artist Rebecca Belmore has been working with story for most of her life. She commonly holds performances where she doesn't speak so as to overcome the need for words. For a while, she relied on witnesses instead of visual recordings to give oral accounts of what happened. She routinely breaks the barriers of rational expectations. I have drawn inspiration from her practice in order to explore the making of something that extends beyond its physical manifestation. Can an object speak for itself in a way that transcends the human language? Can an object hold memory? The English language tends to categorize and oppose things as a process to understand or explain them. Nature versus social spaces, art versus science, human versus non-human, past and future versus present. What if we were to shift our focus and try to see all these things as continuously and inextricably happening all at once? Let me give an example. Cowichan sweaters are a distinctive piece of clothing that have been and are still knitted with intricate and meaningful patterns by Coast Salish women and men who live on the west coast of North America on the land that is also called British Columbia and Vancouver Island. These sweaters emerge from a convergence, or a confrontation, between the sacred knowledge and skill of the art of weaving and the arrival of European settlers that perturb the complex and well-established ways of life already present. These sweaters represent all the seeming contradictions we just named, embodying each at once. There is no differentiation between nature and the social space if the wool comes from animals who live wild alongside humans, or if they are domesticated and cared for by humans. If these animals eat plants that grow wild and offer us their hair to wear on our bodies and use in our living spaces, is the wool not natural anymore once it's collected? It wouldn't make sense to impose such a delimitation. The knitted sweater is arguably at a meeting point of scientific method and innovation as well as art. It is made from both highly complex and rigorously applied techniques to prepare and create the yarn and make the base form from which a specific shape can exist, while also giving way to creative freedom on elements such as content and qualities of the yarn, color, size, patterns, details, etc., ensuring that no two sweaters, although similar, can ever be completely identical. What if we push this thinking further? What if we start considering the person making the sweater, the emotions they felt while working, the life events happening before or at the same time, the way they learned how to work the wool and its significance for them, how the knowledge, the time, and the work are situated at once in the past, in the present, and in the future, as the sweater and the skill continue to exist and to be passed on. These are all qualities and memories that the sweater holds, while also being impossible to communicate fully. Some hints of its story may be visible in the visual quality of the piece, but ultimately all this knowledge and these life experiences become embedded in a language we can't speak, a physical embodiment of memory. Here, the human and the non-human make one, each getting involved in the life of the other. We can call this many things: sentimental value, spiritual value, symbolic value, and so on, but it all comes back to the fact that this object holds value, no matter the type. One Cowichan sweater can have value for me if I were to travel to the West Coast and support an indigenous artisan, and then proceed to wear and cherish this sweater as both a very practical garment and a souvenir, mending the holes as the years wear on. The same sweater will also have value for the person who made it. A lot of ourselves go into our work when making an object from our own hands. I can't be certain what the value would be for someone other than me, but it might be associated with pride, with hard work, with supporting their family, with honoring their multi-generational heritage, with the childhood memories they have of learning from their mother or grandmother, for example. Sarah Modeste, a knitter of the Cowichan community, recalls how her grandmother passed on to her the principles that would guide her through life. Interviewed for the writing of the book Working with Wool by Sylvia Olsen, Sarah says, "My training from my grandmother was to work hard, do it right, never ask for anything, and help people whenever you can. She always said to do it with love in your heart and care in your hands so you do a nice job." Sarah, along with a number of other Coast Salish people deeply invested in sweater making, helped create an entire industry that has boomed, gone out of hand, wrestled with the international market and the competition from imitations, dealt with demand and abuse from buyers, to ease down in recent years now that the younger generations have chosen other occupations as their main revenue, since a more traditionally aligned way of life, especially in areas like the one around Vancouver, is economically not as feasible anymore. Younger generations are still learning and connecting with generational knowledge, values, and spirituality when they are able to, although the economic pressure of the colonial state makes it hard to live through these values in all areas of life. We will be looking at the meaning of Cowichan sweaters as an artistic practice grounded in indigenous knowledge, and the complexity of the relationships surrounding the making of something so significative. I am what we would commonly call a settler, a descendant of European colonizers with no known family or cultural ties to indigenous communities. However, I am also a fiber artist, and I am grateful I get to make beautiful and significant things from what the land generously shares with me. I always strive to see, hear, and understand life from other points of view than the colonial, naturalist, extractivist one. Here, my sharing of this story, I hope, will help us explore and deconstruct some of the modern thinking on how the world works. Although Cowichan or Indian sweaters are mostly perceived as products by the non-native buyer, I believe the people knitting them have not lost their sense of making. This is a story of survival and revival through craft, craft as protection, craft as resilience, craft as world making. I suggest we start with the choice of words. I use producing as a massive, repetitive, economical mean where objects have become commodity in exchange for money, where most objects have no value in and of themselves and are seen as replaceable. On the contrary, I see making as a slow, connected process grounded in knowledge, understanding, symbolism, as in making something come into life, into existence, as a physical language of the story being told by the steps it takes to make it, by bringing meaning into matter and matter into meaning. These sweaters carry a meaning deeper and older than what most settlers could imagine. How can we listen in such a way that we would feel the story? The Cowichan sweater, while being aesthetically and sensorially pleasing, also represents the violence, the transformation, and the resilience happening when a society tries to overcome another. But how can a knitted sweater be taken as serious by a settler audience, considering that modern clothing especially is a result of mass producing in fast fashion, having lost any spiritual meaning in non-traditional societies? Coast Salish women have been wool workers, more specifically weavers, since time immemorial. Wool is central to their creation stories, essential to who they are as a people. They've been doing so forever, making blankets of incredible quality that held significant economic, ceremonial, and spiritual value. They were worn as clothing and used in homes. They were offered in meaningful events as memorabilia for witnesses of the event and as gifts. They were a prized commodity for commercial exchanges. They represented mutual respect. Their materiality represents a tangible connection to the Creator and markers of a worldview that valued knowledge and prestige as wealth in and of themselves. It was made from the land, the wool a gift from the Creator, and permitted wealth among the families. Traditional academics would try to find archaeological or historical evidence of these claims, but I suggest we take their word as is. Why would oral tradition be any lesser proof of a truth than written works? I personally believe nothing to be truer than the lives of the people and the stories they tell. The Coast Salish, like they weave stories together, knit stories together as they say themselves, each piece of work carrying a meaning and speaking through a physical language. The Coast Salish women came to learn knitting through colonization, as young girls got taught by sisters and passed the knowledge on to their families, and as the mountain goat and woolly dogs they used to collect hair from were disappearing, they had to switch to sheep's wool yarn. Their blanket economy almost died out, overtaken by commercially woven blankets such as the Hudson Bay Company's. This was almost total cultural disaster and destruction. However, the Coast Salish figured out how to transform their wool working practice in new ways in order to survive the colonial invasion. The traditional motifs and patterns were transferred from weaving to knitting, blankets became wearable clothing, and the women were able to return to something closer to their previously privileged position of skill keepers and makers in the communities. The underside of this practice is its economic necessity. The Cowichan knitters have turned their skill into a colonial, capitalist commodity, goods-producing industry. Whereas the woven blankets were highly important in economic exchange and social events, their signification was perceived differently. They were prestigious, they held value in and of themselves, they were sacred. If coloniality is characterized by the urge to understand, to control, to dominate, only transformation and adaptation permitted the community to survive through the violent new exigencies of the so-called modern world. Through the selling of screen objects that imitate sacred culture without violating it. In finding new ways to be economically self-sufficient, just as they were before, they've developed a tool against total assimilation. In this case, the Cowichan sweater knitting industry appeared as a perpetual economic and cultural conciliation. However, the Coast Salish wool workers are still in a delicate position by being superficially respected in their craftsmanship, all while being held at social disadvantage, barely staying afloat with their skill. How can we work towards repair? Decolonial and non-colonial does not simply mean doing traditional activities while staying in a colonial context. It means changing the direction from which we approach knowledge. If decolonial means contesting the colonial, non-colonial means doing something from an entirely different worldview. Métis artist, curator, and critical thinker David Garneau speaks of opacity strategies in the battle against colonial domination in order to protect indigenous knowledge from assimilation, appropriation, and exploitation. In the book called Arts of Engagement, taking aesthetic action in and beyond the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, co-written by Kiwi Martin, Dylan Robinson, and David Garneau, he gives examples of mnemonic devices, visual aids that allow for remembering an event, while being impossible to decode for someone who wasn't there. This was part of the meaning of the Coast Salish blankets, a quality that has been passed on, at least in part, onto the sweaters. Like the painting style for which Alex Janvier is known, as Garneau explains, it's only when he got toured by the artist himself that he could learn that his paintings were actually intricate maps representing many things important to Janvier. While looking through the exhibition book, I can see what he saw. Although aesthetically pleasant and considered in Western art language as beautiful examples of abstract painting, its symbolic and emotional meaning gets more and more evident the moment one starts to see not with their eyes, but with their heart, when they're finally able to feel the picture. When we get to use extra-rational means such as our senses to experience new information, we engage in transformative acts. Decolonization is real and complicated, but it's necessary to divert from the path of endless destruction that capitalism and colonization are taking us on. To borrow the words of Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang, two American scholars, decolonization is not a metaphor. They also urge us to ask ourselves collectively as settlers about what is unsettling and what should be unsettling. For this context, I believe that thinking about all the relationships lived through Cowichan sweaters without reducing them to meaningless objects can be a way to honor skill, collective knowledge, and multidirectional memory in a way that does not assume a neoliberal order of the world to be true, and that does not exist in opposition to it, but simply apart from it. Both are not fusible, yet they coexist and enter in relation. An event perfectly exemplified by the works of artists such as Cheryl Lirondelle and Ojima Mikana, who have brought indigenous writing into the public space. By communicating public messages in indigenous languages, with or without translation, this creates an opportunity for opacity, for taking up space, for holding to what is true. The apparition of the sweater is a conciliation between two conflicting cultures. In Working with Wool, Sylvia Olsen opens with the questioning of our collective identity as indigenous, settlers, and immigrants. She says, "My cross-cultural experience of living on the reserve has given me a strong belief that until British Columbia and Canada know and understand their shared history with Indigenous people, the province and country will not fully mature. Our collective history has shaped our identities, but this is a part of ourselves as a country and a province that we do not know very well. Most Canadians have no idea how to get to know the Indigenous part of our history. We're still asking questions like who should tell it, and what should and should not be told. So we stumble around, not really knowing who we are in this province called British Columbia and this country we call Canada, because too many parts of our past are still unknown." The Cowichan sweater holds a contradictory position of being born from both a spiritual and cultural object representing immemorial prestige and knowledge, and the instrumentalization by the settler state of indigenous craft as common culture, its aesthetics appropriated to feed a fantasy of reconciliation. The path between fetishization and being respectful guests is a difficult one. What can we, non-Indigenous, learn from Indigenous ways and philosophies in regard to our relationship to the land and its life force? What needs to be done to repair or create that relationship so that things get experienced under their symbolic meaning again? If the opposite of losing touch is finding touch, In which ways can colonized settlers find touch with relationships they've been trained to get alienated from, even in their own cultures? How or can a practical and aesthetic object be unsettling? We can consider the life of the object as creating a present past, its meaning being carried through generations, either by the object itself or by the transmission of the skill and of the history. Knowledge in itself is undirectional and ever-changing. Knowledge is collective memory, and to refer to the work of Rebecca Belmore, knowledge flows like water.